Well, good evening and welcome to the Wallace Collection Online. I'm delighted this evening to be joined by Dr. Helen Jacobsen, our Curator of French 18th Century Decorative Arts here at the Wallace Collection, and Professor Catriona Seth, Marshal Foch Professor of French Literature at the University of Oxford. And tonight they will be revealing Marie-Antoinette. Without further ado, I'll hand you over to Dr. Jacobsen.
Andrew, thank you very much. And Catriona, welcome. This is so kind of you to come and join us. I'm really sorry I can't be welcoming you to the Wallace Collection and you all to the Wallace Collection. But of course, we are unable to do that at the moment, but you've very kindly agreed to come and reveal Marie-Antoinette as much as we can through the objects and the art that we have at the Wallace Collection. And of course, it'll be virtual, and our virtual journey, I hope, will try and investigate a little bit about the Queen through the decorative art, the paintings, the objects that we have at the Wallace Collection. So what I did wonder though, Catriona, you've worked so much on Marie-Antoinette, more than many other people, and you've had that great privilege of editing her letters. You published recently a volume of her letters. And I wonder, when you do that, do you get under the skin? Do you find you came to know Marie-Antoinette in some way?
Helen, good evening. It's lovely to be here, and thank you for that very good question. I think one of the important things about Marie-Antoinette is to try and find out who she really was, because she's now a character in so many films, in Japanese mangas. She's recognized the world over. She's probably the most famous French woman ever, and yet she's very famous to people who wouldn't know in what century she lived, or what she did, who she was, where she was born, and so on. And I think that by reading her letters, in the same way as we're going tonight to look at some of the objects which relate to her, we can get closer to her personality and closer to the human being she really was. And that's why I'm very excited to be on this virtual tour with you, looking at some of the wonderful objects you have in the Wallace Collection, and hoping very soon that, like the other members of the audience, we can be back inside and looking at them properly. But let's look at the pictures and start with this wonderful scene of Marie-Antoinette and her family in Vienna. Marie-Antoinette is the 15th of 16 children of Francis Stephen and Maria Theresa. And this is an absolutely wonderful picture to have. There are different versions of it because they sort of serve like family photos. When a new child comes along, they will be added. So there are versions of the scene, and you see the older ones growing up, you know, and for instance, the boys getting into a male costume, and you'll generally have a small child in the center, and the small child will be the youngest. And on this scene, the youngest one just happens to be Marie-Antoinette. And I think one of the aspects which this particular scene shows very clearly is profusion, the profusion of children. And in the 18th century, if you were a royal prince, particularly if you're a royal prince and you had any expectation of succeeding to the throne, you'd want to make sure that you had heirs. And Maria Theresa, by posing like this with all her children, is showing that she has lots of children, and in a sense also showing that potentially her offspring will also be able to people the rest of the world. And so in a sense, one of the things this is doing by showing Marie-Antoinette as having lots of brothers and sisters is also showing Marie-Antoinette as being potentially like her mother, at the head of a large family. We know that that wasn't to happen, but it was something I think implicit in this sort of painting.
And of course, this points to the future, doesn't it? Because Maria Theresa was using her children as envoys out there in the world, in Europe, as a marriage mark, really, to get them spread out across Europe so that the dynasty would continue through her children.
Yes, and it was said quite often that one of the sort of unofficial mottos of Austria was other people wage war, tu felix Austria nubes, which you happy Austria, you marry, with the idea that by getting the archdukes and archduchesses, that's what the royal children were called, by getting the archdukes and archduchesses to marry into other royal houses or to marry other heads of state, was a way of exercising power indirectly, or was a way of creating a network of allies. And Maria Theresa was very, very good at this. And so she made sure that several of her children ended up making dynastically advantageous marriages. So for instance, one of Marie-Antoinette's sisters, Maria Carolina, marries the King of Naples. Another, Marie-Amélie, marries the Infant of Parma, and so on. But the one marriage of which Maria Theresa was most proud was her marriage of Marie-Antoinette to the heir to the throne of France, the Dauphin, who would then become Louis XVI. There's just one other thing I'd like to say before we move on from this picture, which is that if you look, the boys are on Maria Theresa's side and the girls are on Francis Stephen's side. There's very much a gendered conception of power. Paradoxically, Maria Theresa actually thinks that girls shouldn't reign and that girls shouldn't be given any political instruction. Power is with the men. And so she had her children educated according to their gender. And she's very much siding with the men because they're the ones who will directly be more powerful dynastically. She sees herself as an exception rather than an example that should be followed.
And this, of course, this education didn't really help Marie Antoinette later on, did it? But we will come to that, I suspect.
Indeed, it didn't help Marie Antoinette when she was sent to marry the Dauphin of France. And I think one of the things we probably need to say about the Dauphin at this stage is that he wasn't the son of the king, he was the grandson. He wasn't expecting to succeed to the throne. When he was a small boy, he had a father who should have succeeded to the throne before him. He also had a brother who was older than he was. So he was third in line and he ended up being the heir. But I think all the way through one gets the impression that he might have been an involuntary heir to the throne, that he'd rather have preferred to have been just one of the spares rather than being thrust into the limelight. And as we know, it all ended badly for him. This is a rather splendid object, a small bejeweled portrait. And I think it's interesting because it reminds us of the different functions of pictures. Since some of the pictures are about showing your power, some pictures function as mementos or as sort of something you could put in a pocket or carry around with you. And some, in a sense, do both. So some are at once to show something off and to have close to you. And I suppose that's the way a lot of things like lockets, portrait rings, and so on would have functioned in the 18th century. And this is a particularly splendid object, because it is a jewel as well as being a portrait.
It is, and it's very much in the tradition of the jeweled portrait of the monarch that was given to a diplomat, an ambassador, when they were departing from a court. Although I think with this one, that we're probably looking at a 19th century mount, because there are very, very few 18th century diplomatic portraits known. They're called boîtes à portraits. They're not boxes at all, but they're known as that. And they're encrusted with diamonds. But I've got to say the diamonds on the 18th century ones are really big, stonking diamonds. And this looks a bit too 19th century. But anyway, here is Louis XVI. And on this clock, we have the most wonderful gilt bronze clock here, which was made in the year of Louis XVI's accession to the throne. And we have the young Louis dressed in Roman armor, being advised by Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, as to how best to govern France, which I find rather sad, really, given that 15 years later where it got him. But it's the most spectacular clock. And rather, I think, hopeful of what is to come, you know, the new reign, the new king, the new queen, everything to look forward to. And it was that Marie Antoinette must have thought about it too.
And certainly when Louis XVI succeeds, to his grandfather, Louis XV. So when Louis XV dies and Louis XVI then becomes king, there is a great wave of hope, and you can see it in, for instance, something like this mantle clock, but also in poems. All the papers are full of poems. Lots of poets are penning, lines about how wonderful it is. This is the new reign and it's a new age. And they think sort of youth and wealth and happiness are bound to come with the new reign. So as you say, it's unfortunate that things ended as they did. But I think this clock is absolutely spectacularly beautiful. And of course, the mechanism with having this orb, this central orb, makes it, I presume, extremely rare and precious. And it's a time when France is very much in the throes of fascination with watchmaking and clockmaking.
Well, it's an example of a horizontal dial clock, and in fact, they didn't last very long. They were quite rare because, well, we don't know why, but looking at them myself, I have a hunch that it's because they're not very easy to tell the time. I mean, you've really got to look at that and work out where the fleur-de-lis is pointing. Whereas, when you look at a normal dial, it's straight away you can see where the hand is pointing. But she was exposed at court to the family, the royal family, and at first I think wasn't she taken under the wings of Louis XVI's aunts, the mesdames?
When Marie-Antoinette arrives at the French court, she's seen as a representative of Austria, of course, which is an ally of France, but hasn't been a traditional ally of France. So there's some disquiet in certain quarters at court. Louis XV, who is still on the throne when Marie-Antoinette arrives, has a mistress living at court, Madame du Barry, which the teenage Marie-Antoinette considers appallingly shocking. And there is what is known as the Parti Dévot, so very much the devout, staunchly Catholic party, which doesn't like Madame du Barry either. And that's made up of Mesdames Tantes, so the aunts, and they're all known as Madame, followed by their Christian name. And these are the daughters, the unmarried daughters of Louis XV. Only one of his daughters, the first daughter, was allowed to marry, and all the others were kept at home. Madame Victoire is one of them, Victoire, Sophie, Adélaïde. We hear all about their character and what they do and what they like. And Madame Victoire is the sort of homely one, and we have here the most beautiful knotting shuttle which belonged to her and which is bejeweled and which has a cipher on it. And knotting became a very fashionable pastime. You know the way, for instance, the first lockdown, everybody was into crocheting. Well, this is the rather more upmarket version. Everybody was into knotting, which is a bit like macrame. And knotting became something which no fashionable lady would admit to ignoring, and they would all sit down and do their knotting. So it became a usual present. So you'd be given knotting shuttles, you'd be given bags in which to put your knotting silks and so on. But knotting wasn't particularly useful. It didn't produce anything remarkable. And Rousseau says that it takes as much effort to entertain a woman who is knotting as a woman who is doing nothing at all, because he says, faire des nœuds, c'est ne rien faire. So to be knotting is like to be doing nothing at all. So it's very much an aristocratic way of passing the time.
Well, we shouldn't pass on from this image, though, without looking a little bit at the sculpture of Madame Victoire, which is the most superb piece by Houdon. We, in fact, the Wallace collection is very rich in sculpture, but nothing like it once was, actually, because when the bequest was made to the nation, half the collection, which had been in Paris, remained in Paris and was then sold 15 or 20 years later. But before it was split up, it was probably the most important private collection of French 18th sculpture that's been put together. And we have this fabulous Houdon to remind us of that. And then a couple more of the family favorites. Who have we got here?
So we have Louis XVI's brother. Louis XVI has, or the future Louis XVI has two brothers who both became kings, strangely enough. So not only was he sort of third in line, but his brothers shouldn't have become kings either, since Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette had two boys, but both his brothers did. The first brother to become king, Louis XVIII, Louis XVIII, he's a very cunning character. He's also, because he's cunning, he's not always as generous with Marie-Antoinette as one might hope. He's thought to have been someone who sponsored some of the publication of caricatures or texts against Marie-Antoinette, which circulated or at very least propagated rumors about her. And he's seen here, of course, when he's become king, looking very portly, which he was. And next to him, Madame Elisabeth is Louis XVI's younger sister, who initially, she's only a child when Marie-Antoinette gets to Versailles, and they're not particularly close initially. They become close during the Revolution, because once Louis XVI's brothers have left France, Madame Elisabeth stays in France with Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette, and they spend time together and end up in prison together. And in fact, Madame Elisabeth will be the third one of them to be guillotined, Louis XVI first, then Marie-Antoinette, then Madame Elisabeth. And that's an absolutely exquisite miniature you have here. But your collection of miniatures is so fantastic. I can't wait to see them again.
Yes, and many of them are beautifully hung in the boudoir cabinet, you recall, which gives them a sort of jewel-like quality as well. You can really get close to them. Well, the third sibling, if you like, is the Comte d'Artois. And when Marie-Antoinette first arrives in France and the first few years of her life there, doesn't she pal up with the Comte d'Artois? They're quite close in age, aren't they?
Yes, they're close in age, and the Comte d'Artois, the younger brother, is also the fun-loving one. So Marie-Antoinette, who's left to her own devices to a large extent, because Louis XVI isn't particularly excited about having a young bride. He's much more interested in going hunting and things like that. The person who wants to have fun and stay up all night and go to balls and so on is the Comte d'Artois, who will become the third brother to become king, Charles X, after the revolution and after the death of Louis XVIII. What's interesting here is that the Comte d'Artois has exquisite taste. He absolutely loves beautiful things, and he loves anything which is fashionable. He's very much a trendsetter. So horse races become fashionable, he'll get into horse racing. But it's true also in the decorative arts. I think he's one of the people who has an eye for interesting objects and for novelty, but also for quality. And one of the things I think which is interesting here, you have the pair, which is absolutely beautiful, is the way in which very often at the time things are thought of in pairs or as sets. They go together. There are objects which are part of a sort of decorative program in a sense.
Yes, very much so. And these were for his bedroom, actually, at Versailles, delivered, as you can see, 1773. This is quite he's quite precocious in his taste. He's often ahead of the curve, actually. These are very much in a militaristic style. You can see on the corners there's a kind of winged helmet. And originally on the gilt bronze medallion on the front was a quiver and a Herculean pelt, underlining, the military element. And the Comte d'Artois was colonel of the Swiss Guards. So I think this was something to celebrate that. But he didn't keep them long, because a couple of years later, they went to his wife's room at Versailles, which I think is slightly less appropriate, actually, even by non-gendered standards of the day. But this is something that his wife, I've got to show this chair, because many people listening, I'm sure, will know it from the Wallace collection. It's the most stunning armchair with carving of exquisite quality, much superior to what one often finds on chairs. Probably so good, in fact, to have been done by a sculptor rather than a chair maker. And it has the initials for the Comtesse d'Artois. We don't know exactly where it was made for, but we think it was made for her.
And it's been beautifully reupholstered in silk, which is to the original design, presumably.
Well, we're lucky enough, as you know, that there are various French companies, including Prel in Lyon, which has wonderful archives of silks. And so happily for us, a very generous donor was allowed us to do this, because it was in a rather shocking state, the upholstery. And we were able to choose a fabric from the period, from about 1770, the end of Louis XV's reign. Which happily also goes terribly well in the space where we display the chair. So we're very happy with our chair.
It's absolutely spectacular.
And this, of course, is Bagatelle, which is the little pavilion, the Maison de Plaisance, built by the Comte d'Artois in a matter apparently of 60 days, in a bet with Marie-Antoinette.
So it is said, and it's just outside Paris. Has a wonderful rose garden, and I think for us is fascinating because it is a sort of, it's a miniature version of everything taste was about at the time. It's a sort of, you know, like a model pavilion in a sense. It's showing us what you would expect the building to look like if it were built exactly according to the taste of the time. So it's perfect. It's perfect. Unfortunately, it no longer has its original furniture, but it very much is, I think, for us, an architectural jewel.
No, it doesn't have its original furniture, but we do. Well, we have
Even
this
better.
wonderful clock, anyway, at least, which was made for the Comte d'Artois at Bagatelle for the salon. He had, as you've pointed out, very specific taste. And in fact, he had 3 clocks delivered before he decided to keep one, which was this one. And at the time, he kept it under a glass cloche, which often surprises people, because I think we think of the Victorians keeping their porcelain or their clocks under these glass cloches, but indeed he did, presumably because of its exquisite gilding, which would pick up dust and things. And if it's on a chimney piece, which it was, soot from the chimney. So you want to preserve that away from harm's way.
And possibly also because of the mechanism. I see it's by Lepaute, who's one of the great clockmakers, but presumably it would also have a sensitive mechanism. What I think is absolutely fascinating about this clock is that if you sort of did a quick and dirty history of French decorative arts, you would say, now, of course, Egypt becomes the flavor of the day or the month or the year when Napoleon has been to Egypt, the Campagne d'Egypte, so after the revolution. And yet here we have already Egyptian influences, which I think really illustrates to what extent the future Charles X was ahead of the curve.
Yeah, I think it certainly does. And his sister-in-law, Marie-Antoinette, also had this wonderful passion for beautiful decorative art, for beautiful objects to surround herself with. And this is one of our most gorgeous desks by Jean-Henri Riesener. And I show you it open as well, because it's rather fun, Catriona, to see all the little secret hidey holes and the drawers and things that kept private papers out of sight. And Marie-Antoinette must have been desperate for some privacy at some stage.
I think she was, and she very rarely gets it. And this explains that, for instance, when she has to write a note to the Austrian ambassador, who's the person she writes to most often when she's at court in Versailles, she often writes them on miniature scraps of paper, something hurried. So she would have used a desk like this. The advantage of the full front desk, of course, is that you can just pull it down and you've instantly got somewhere to write. And you then pull open a drawer and you'd have everything. You'd have the paper, you'd have the sealing wax, you'd have your pen and ink and so on. And I think it's exactly the type of object you can imagine her using at once for something like a hurried note, and of course when she had to sit down and write her endless letters to her mother when she was first married, explaining that no, she wasn't pregnant, and yes, the Dauphin was being very nice to her, but no, she was very sorry that there was no news on that front, sort of thing.
No. Well, she had, this is 1780, and she had by this time actually conceived and given birth to her eldest daughter, who was known as Madame Royale. And at the same time, well, similar time, a couple of months later perhaps, that this desk was delivered. Riesener delivered rather sweetly a corner cupboard, which had a plaque on it of a child being offered up to France. And it was noted specifically that Marie-Antoinette was going to put a bust of Madame Royale on this corner cupboard. So the child would be always with her in her private sitting room.
Yes, Marie-Antoinette does look after her children very much as a sort of modern mother. She has her children around her all the time. And there are reports of the fact that people like the Austrian ambassador whom I was mentioning earlier on, he complains and he says, I can't possibly ever see her because, whenever she's not somewhere in official capacity, she has that child around, I can't talk to her. So
That's amazing.
Yes, so she has her elder daughter, the only one of her children who survives the revolution. She's christened Marie-Thérèse Charlotte because she is the goddaughter of her grandmother, Maria Theresa. And when Maria Theresa's children have children of their own, Maria Theresa is their godmother. And when she's asked what a Christian name they should be given, she always says, well, if it's a girl, obviously Marie-Thérèse. So this was no exception. And Marie-Thérèse Charlotte is Madame Royale. So that's a title like Princess Anne being the Princess Royal. Madame Royale is a specific title for the elder daughter of the king, as Louis XVI then is. And Marie-Antoinette refers to her as Mousseline la Sérieuse. It's her nickname for her daughter.
Well, we, as you are well aware, have a great collection of Riesener furniture, much of it owned by Marie-Antoinette. This chest of drawers is something that I continually go back to, actually, because for me it just shows something of the detail and the elegance and the preciousness of the mounts that Riesener was able to produce for his furniture for Marie-Antoinette, all specially designed for her. And this picks up your point about the decorative program that was going on in these palaces. It was not random how these things looked. And on the right, you see a reweaving of the wool silk in Marie-Antoinette's private sitting room. And you can see that the medallion on the chest of drawers reflects the silk medallion, and originally would have been colored as well. It would have been very much in keeping with the wool silk. But we can't really talk about Marie-Antoinette's taste and her attitudes to fashion without thinking of Vigée-Lebrun. And I just wonder, do you think, Marie-Antoinette she was very young when she went to France. She must have absorbed a lot of French style and French fashion. Do you think people like Vigée-Lebrun acted as kind of guides to this world of haute luxe and fashion?
I think Vigée-Lebrun and Marie-Antoinette, in a sense, taught each other something. I think they were the ideal, that Vigée-Lebrun was the ideal painter for Marie-Antoinette, and Marie-Antoinette was the ideal subject for Vigée-Lebrun, that in a sense they found something, they had common ground. This little reproduction by Touron of Vigée-Lebrun's self-portrait is interesting in itself. Vigée-Lebrun was obviously seen on the one hand as, an exception because she was a woman painter. And that was good in some ways, but in other ways it was a way of doing her down and saying, oh, well, she's not as good as the men and this sort of thing. But she was made a member of the Academy, the Académie Royale, which was absolutely exceptional for women. There'd only been, I think, 4 women before her. And this particular self-portrait, she talks about it in her subsequent memoirs, and she talks about the fact that she bases it in part on a Rubens portrait. And so she's sort of playing a double game. She's referring to Rubens on the one hand and saying, look, I can paint like Rubens. So like a major male portraitist. She'd been traveling in Northern Europe, which is when she'd seen a number of Rubens paintings. But she's also saying, so she's saying, I'm a beautiful woman, like the beautiful woman Rubens painted, but I'm as good as Rubens at painting it. She's painting herself with her palette. So I think that it's an interesting choice, a way of sort of showing a fairly firm command of what she wants to show. And there's a lovely story about Vigée-Lebrun, who only had one daughter, Julie, painting a portrait of Marie-Antoinette when she was heavily pregnant. and she drops her brushes or knocks over her brushes. And Marie-Antoinette instinctively rushes to pick them up, which of course is completely contrary to etiquette, but was a sort of natural gesture for someone like Marie-Antoinette, who spontaneously just wanted to help out, and I think felt some common destiny in a sense with this other young woman.
How charming, what a lovely story. By this time, 1781, she is pregnant again. And this is to be the Dauphin, the first Dauphin. These candlesticks, they're a pair, were given to Marie-Antoinette, or were delivered for her when she had given birth to the son, to the Dauphin. And of all the works of gilt bronze, Louis XVI period gilt bronze we have in the Wallace collection, I think these two are the most exquisite, the most detailed, the most highly finished, and almost like goldsmith's work rather than gilt bronze, which is effectively brass, which has then been gilded. But you can see the dolphin, the Dauphin, which is the name given to the heir to the throne. And in the base, those wonderful little tiny fleur-de-lis, which have been put into the trellis work there. And I can just imagine Marie-Antoinette sitting in her private study with the candles flickering here.
Yes, I'm sure they'd have brought great joy.
And she loved this gilt bronze. It was something that I think we have to remember in the lighting that they had available to them in the 18th century. Of course, firelight and candlelight. You know, that was it in the evenings or on grey days. And gilt bronze really comes to life when you see it in that environment. I mean, under our ghastly electric lighting, perhaps it doesn't do it justice. But I've actually put in 2 slides here because I just wanted to show you the detail, the extraordinary detail on this. This is a very interesting piece in its own right. But for our purposes, what's fascinating is that Marie-Antoinette bought this in 1782 from a sale, from an auction. So I rather like the idea that she bought something that another collector had put together. It's not all about new with Marie-Antoinette.
Now, I think she's interested in specific beautiful objects. She's also interested, for instance, in lacquer, oriental lacquer objects or things like that. There are certain, she does have certain elements of taste which will lead her to have a sort of collector's eye. And the extraordinary thing about this, of course, is what it does. It's a brûle parfum. So literally it burns incense or perfume. And why would you need one of those? Well, quite simply because it often smells quite bad in places like Versailles in the 18th century. There are lots of people. Versailles is not just the home to the royal family. There are dozens and dozens of courtiers who will live there, of people with military responsibilities. There will be domestic servants aplenty and so on. And there's a whole sort of a rivalry within the court circles about who gets which room, who gets to be near the king or near the queen, or who gets to have a room with a window or a room with a fireplace. So it really is like a sort of small city is Versailles. And even though Marie-Antoinette obviously is in the nicest parts of Versailles, that doesn't mean to say that there aren't sort of rats running around the courtyards or things like that at times. So it would have been, I think, necessary on occasion to have a brûle parfum, even if you were the queen. And of course, she was one of the princesses who was interested in bathing. Not everybody was at the time either. So, the level of hygiene might not have been what we would like to think of as the sort of minimum necessary standard nowadays.
And so it must have been, sorry, it must have been a most oppressive environment for her as well, with all these people always all around her. Presumably she's never left on her own, but she always has a servant or a lady in waiting or somebody around her. And so she apparently loves going to the Petit Trianon. Do you find that? Yeah.
Yes, the Petit Trianon, which a number of people watching will know, is actually part of the Versailles estate, but it's away from the main chateau, and it's like its own. It's like a sort of little kingdom of its own. And if you've ever been there, really, it's a sort of house which is of a size in which one could imagine oneself living. You know, one couldn't live in Versailles, it's just too large, but the Petit Trianon, you could imagine living there. And it really is an exquisite place. It's you know, it's very elegant, but it's not grandiose. There's nothing oppressive about it in the way there can be in Versailles. And it's surrounded by the most beautiful gardens, landscaped for Marie-Antoinette. And for her, I think it's very much the place where she wants to be, the place where she can spend time with her children, with her friends, where etiquette can be much more relaxed, and where people aren't, you know, forever walking through to look at her. When she's in Versailles, you know, you can actually go and watch the king eating or watch the queen eating or things like that. So the Petit Trianon is a place where she can be herself and away from prying eyes.
And she can also have more of a hand in the furniture and the objects with which she surrounds herself, because it is her domain, isn't it? It is the domain of the queen. And she continues to use Riesener. And with this desk, this absolutely charming full front desk, I think you can see the way he designs the mounts to really reflect her great loves. And her great loves are for the garden, for the outdoors, for flowers. And these mounts have this wonderful mixture of flowers and grasses, and must have been a superb foil, really, to the white walls, because she loved plain, well, there was beautifully sculpted walls, but the gilding and the marquetry must have been very sumptuous in an otherwise more simple space.
Yes, and this is clearly a smaller desk than the other full front desk we looked at. And I think that just reflects also the fact that we're not thinking of a piece of furniture which would go in one of the larger rooms in Versailles, but in the smaller rooms in the Trianon. And Marie-Antoinette does get into smaller sizes of furniture, detail, different types of detail, and so on. And your point about the gilt bronze and the way it would have reflected light. I mean, if we look at something like this, can you imagine with the flickering candlelight how it would have been? And Marie-Antoinette has one of the rooms in the Petit Trianon, which serves as a drawing room for her. She has, for the windows, she has sort of screens inside, which are mirrors, so that instead of shuttering the windows at night, you can have mirrors. So the mirrors, of course, will, you know, reflect the room, but they'll also reflect the candlelight. So it's a way of creating a form of intimacy, I think, through light and through this particularly beautiful sort of gilded light that would have been, rather than the cold light, thanks to this gilt bronze.
We know quite a bit about the object with which she surrounded herself, but she did have, as I mentioned, her own private administration. On the back of that full front desk, on the left you see the stamp MA, the Garde-Meuble de la Reine, which was her private wardrobe. So this did not come through the usual channels of the state administration. It came through her own Garde-Meuble. And then the CT, the Chateau Trianon stamp. So we know it was in the Trianon, we know it was in her boudoir, actually. But the records, unfortunately, have been lost of the Garde-Meuble de la Reine. So we're very lucky when we do find a piece of furniture which has this to show us that it really was there, and we can match it up against the archives if we're lucky. But now we're in the middle of the 1780s, so Marie-Antoinette is she feeling comfortable as queen by this stage? Has she found her feet? She's got an heir, she's got children around her.
I think on the one hand, yes, you know, her private life is probably more enjoyable than when she first got to Versailles. But of course, there is also, I think, the feeling of unrest, a lot of criticism leveled at her. So it's not necessarily a particularly easy time either. I don't think Marie-Antoinette had that much of an easy ride, even in the sort of mid-1780s.
Well, this unrest that you're talking about, for much of it, she was blamed, wasn't she, even early on, as the foreigner interfering and the Austrian presence. this is a rather convoluted way of bringing us to the events of 1789, because these beautiful objects, in a very different style, these are buhl marquetry or patinated and gilt bronze clock and barometer, very much the objects belonging to a collector, and they were collected by Baron Besenval, who was this charming courtier who also happened to be a soldier, and he was the man that Louis XVI put in charge of the troops in Paris on the 14th of July, 1789, and the storming of the Bastille. And at that point, Marie-Antoinette's life must have been just extraordinary.
I think the royal family doesn't measure the importance of the 14th of July, 1789 when it happens. I think things are looking bad, but they can't imagine at that stage how bad they will be. I think the moment when it becomes clear that there is no stopping revolution is what the French refer to as the Journée d'Octobre, the October days in October 1789, when the royal family is taken to Paris. I think that's the sort of first instance where it becomes absolutely clear that things are going to change radically for someone like Marie-Antoinette.
And they're taken to Paris. They are housed in the Tuileries, and they have a certain amount of freedom, I think, at this stage, although they're closely watched, I'm sure, on what they do. But this is the time, a year or so later, when they take part in the very, very unfortunate, unsuccessful flight to Varennes, their chance to try and escape. And the flight to Varennes was funded, at least in part, by private supporters of Marie-Antoinette and Louis XVI, including Quentin Crawford, who's this rather extraordinary and fascinating spy, collector, man about town in Paris. He is later to marry, but is currently living with a woman, Eleonora O'Sullivan, who becomes the mistress of Axel Fersen. And so that brings me, Catriona, to this question of Axel Fersen, the Swedish army officer who Marie-Antoinette is often linked with. It's often said that they had an affair. Having read her letters, having really got into the inner Marie-Antoinette, what's your take on that? How do you think this relationship evolved?
I mean, they're clearly very, very fond of each other. I mean, the question then becomes, did they sleep with each other or not? And, you know, I don't think so, but that may be my modern take on it. I think Marie-Antoinette is too much a woman of duty, but she very clearly has extremely strong feelings for Fersen. And we have the letters or some of the letters which she wrote to Fersen during the revolution. And I think they can only be understood if you read them with her other letters of the time. And it's very much a political correspondence written to a dearly loved friend, but it is a political correspondence. It is about, you know, what the future holds in political and dynastic terms, and not simply a series of love letters to an absent and dearly beloved Swedish friend.
Well, meantime, and we should say that she does seem to have a rather loving relationship with her husband at this stage too. I mean, they've produced several children. They enjoy being with each other, do they?
Well, they have 4 children, and certainly during the revolution, Marie-Antoinette becomes the driving force of the couple. The king spends a lot of the revolution quite depressed. Their first son, the first Dauphin, dies just before the Estates General in 1789. And the king seems to have been extremely depressed by that, possibly because it was casting him back to the time when he himself realized that he would have to be king, even though he'd hoped he wouldn't be. And so the second boy becomes the effective Dauphin. And I think during the whole of the revolution, Marie-Antoinette is the leading force also, because the king is the one who has some form of political authority and who's often being asked to do things which go against the grain. So he's being asked to support legislation with which he doesn't agree, for instance. And I think he's finding that morally very hard. And so Marie-Antoinette is the one who is managing the couple's underhand relationship with foreign powers, with the hope that it might lead to better days ahead.
These two are part of a set of 4, the almanacs that you see here, which were actually made for Louis XV, a couple of generations beforehand. But they are, to me, they're very poignant because they were discovered after his death at the Tuileries, where Louis XVI must have taken them with him from Versailles when they were moved to the Tuileries in 1789. And they belonged to his grandfather. And it's something that he must have treasured because he wanted to take it with him to, well, what became house arrest, effectively.
And it's rather wonderful also because one of the things the revolution did was to change the calendar. Because in Ancien Régime France, of course, the calendar was, the calendar we have, but it also was marked by the fact that every day was a saint's day. And so, for instance, rather than celebrating your birthday, you would celebrate your name day. So having an almanac like this would be very useful because you would say, today it is, Saint Gabriel, for instance. I must, sort of wish a happy name day to all the Gabriels I know, or the Gabriels I know, and so on. And that, of course, was changed by the revolution when they invented all these wonderful names of months, Nivous, Fructidor, and so on. And they had a week, which was no longer a week, but what they call a décade, so a 10-day week. In effect. So this would very much have been an Ancien Régime calendar.
And that brings us now to the sad last days. So Louis XVII, the small boy, his father was executed in January 1793, is that right?
Yeah, 21st of January 1793, yeah.
And this poor boy then became Louis XVII, treated abysmally, I think, in prison, and really something that ever since people have got behind and just thought how ghastly that the treatment was of this boy.
Yes, he was taken from his mother, whereas his sister, who was older, was left with his mother initially. And the idea, I think, was to transform him into something which was not like the king he might have been. And so to give him a Republican upbringing, and therefore a sort of a very vulgar upbringing. So he's put in the hands of someone who is a cobbler by trade, and he seems not to have been looked after particularly well. And he dies, as you can see. No, you can't see. I thought we had his dates on.
No.
But he dies while he's still in prison at the Temple, which of course has led all sorts of people to think that maybe he could have been, sort of swapped for another boy, and possibly he could have lived on and so on. But he seems to have died and to have spent the end of his life in really unpleasant conditions as a young boy. And one of the particularly unpleasant things is, of course, that he was asked to bear witness, or at least to sign a statement accusing his mother of incest. And that was one of the things which was brought up at the trial and was a completely trumped up charge, as immediately became obvious. But clearly it's a very, very sad tale, is that of little Louis.
This is quite an interesting little miniature, in fact, because it says the dates you were looking at perhaps are rather, we don't know exactly when it was painted, because Dumont painted around this early 1790s and later in the 1800s. And the thing about this is it's set in this fabulous little frame with fleur-de-lis and with the lily of the Bourbon lily on the top, and on the back there is a symbol of the broken lily. So this seems very much as though it might be a royalist token, somebody wanting to commemorate the person who they still believe to be king at a time when Napoleon was emperor.
Yes, there were lots of sort of royalist tokens, some of them just like coins or things like that, which, for instance, referred to either the executed king and queen or to Louis XVII. There were sort of hidden profiles in pictures or pieces of china and so on. There was, I think, very quickly a sort of memorial type of art which arose. So this is a particularly splendid version.
It is. And that brings us really to the last image that we want to show today, which is the trial of Marie-Antoinette. How did she cope with that and the pressures?
The trial is a relatively short trial compared with that of Louis XVI, one where she's not allowed time to prepare with her lawyers or anything of the sort. It's very clear from the start what the outcome is going to be. The accusations are quite diverse. There are various witnesses brought to accuse her of different things. They're not very high quality witnesses on the whole. And she responds quite calmly. And, so she, for instance, when she's asked, what she wanted, she says, well, I want the happiness of France and of my son. And that, her vision is that, she's French because, or she wants the happiness of France because she's the mother of the King of France, or the boy who's supposed to be King of France. And so I think she has a sense of duty which guides her through here. And I think helps her to confront her accusers. And so on the 16th of October, 1793, she is executed. And she's executed by the revolutionary powers. And she's executed when she's someone who has no political value to the French monarchy. In France, the king is consecrated, sacré. They talk about the coronation is the sacre, in fact. And the king is is marked on his forehead by holy oil, which is said to have been in a sort of sacred ampulla, which the Holy Spirit is said to have delivered. So the kings of France are kings by divine right. This is all part of the legend of the monarchy. But queens aren't. Queens are just wives of kings. So they have no political, no sacred value. And by executing Marie-Antoinette, who was not a political figure, rather than, for instance, exiling her and sending her back to Austria where she was born, the revolutionaries actually transformed her into something more than she was. And I think that part of the reason that she has become such a celebrated figure is because she was seen as this sort of martyr to something which, a cause in a sense, which was a cause thrust upon her.
Well, it certainly didn't take long, did it, for that the martyrdom to become to grow into celebrity status, really, as you say. And certainly by the time this was painted, this lovely watercolor in 1845, she was considered to be the tragic Queen of France, and the mythology built up already around her, which has continued to this day. And really the whole story tugged at the heartstrings, I think, not just of foreigners, was it, but also of French people in the 19th century.
Very much so. And indeed, the Empress Eugénie is fascinated by the fate of Marie-Antoinette. And there's very much a sort of dual vision of Marie-Antoinette. On the one hand, the Marie-Antoinette painted by Didier Lebrun, so this superb fashion icon, the beautiful woman with great taste who loves jewels, who sets trends, etc. And on the other, you're right, the poignant woman who's put on trial, who then becomes a martyr to a cause, and who, on the whole, is seen as a figure of a mother who wanted, her son to be happy, and someone who has been harmed by the state for reasons of politics, which in a sense shouldn't have struck her.
Well, Catriona, thank you very much indeed for leading us through this virtual journey. I should perhaps tell everybody that you've done this great series of podcasts as well, in the footsteps of Marie-Antoinette, which is available on the Oxford University website, which covers not only objects in the Wallace collection, but also Waddesdon Manor. And then you go to the conciergerie for those final few days of Marie-Antoinette's life. So we're really very grateful, and thank you.
No, it's lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much. And as I said, I can't wait to be back and to see everything again.